times.
Oh, sure thing. Waabizheshikana. Waabizheshikana. Oh, hold on one moment.
You can keep practicing. And if you want Sam in your head and he's not here, you can look up the Ojibwe People's Dictionary and look up Waabizheshe, and that is the name of American marten. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and then kindly introduce Sam, who is the president of Urban Ecosystems, the Twin Cities-based landscape architecture practice. He was lead designer for the interpretive plan for the Waabizheshikana, formerly the Western Waterfront Trail in Duluth, and is going to share the process by which the team sought to celebrate the peoples, plants, animals, and landscapes along the waterfront. So Sam, thank you so much for being here. Thanks to everyone who could log in and take it away.
Great, thank you, Luciana. So yeah, I guess I can start by just talking a little bit about this cover image. The trail was renamed Waabizheshikana back in 2019, and that one of the things that was a real stated goal of the whole process was to really incorporate Native American languages and worldviews and perspectives into this plan and the whole process. And this illustration was done by Sarah Agaton Howes, who's a local artist and member of the Fond du Lac band. It's of the American marten, really, I think, expresses what I think we felt was this connection between the people, wildlife, and plants of the river estuary with each other and with the whole place as a sort of major crossroads and destination for all life for millennia. And there was a number of things that we encountered during the design process that I think we really wanted to have a very sort of open and exploratory attitude to which history we were celebrating, and really trying to make an effort to sort of find and see things that are right in front of us that oftentimes, because of the way we look at stuff, we just don't see. So I can start with a little bit of the background and context. So this image you see here is a drone shot of some of the backwaters on the St. Louis River along the area where the Waabizheshikana Trail is located over on the western end of Duluth. So one of the, there's a very famous quote from Chief Beazwa, who's a sort of noteworthy statesman who was a tribal leader in this area. And this quote is one that you can find that's really just about how this is just this incredible geographic location, located at the far end of the St. Louis River, and then also at the far end of Lake Superior, where because of its location as kind of the end of navigable waters, became this very important crossroads for people and trade to move through. And also that in particular that this spot is just, it's just crawling with life and is, just sort of has an abundance of natural beauty and character that that really makes you want to stay there. And so that's where Chief Beazwa called it the center of all good things, or Nagajiwanong, where the place where the water stops. And this map is one that was produced, by an artist named Martin McCluskey, who mapped out a lot of the historic Native American sites that existed all along the St. Louis River estuary in terms of sugar bushes, burial grounds, campsites, and really just just showing the sort of wide range of like just how densely settled this area has been for such a long time. And so the Waabizheshikana Trail was formerly the Western Waterfront Trail, stretches from Fond du Lac, and I'll do a little bit of annotation here, down at the west end of the river, up to right near Indian Point and Kingsbury Bay, up at the north end of the trail. And the area that it crosses through, it really, when the initial planning was done by the city, so there was the intention to transform this trail. It was divided up into a series of segments so it could be strategically implemented over time. And so we retained that structure, but then also developed an overlay method for organizing and orienting visitors along the trail so that there would be waypoints and places that would provide sort of theme and character to visitors as they explore this area. And as visitors go along this area, they pass through a lot of different neighborhoods, from Fond du Lac to Geer and New Duluth, Morgan Park, Smithville, Riverside. And each of these areas has its own distinct and interesting, fascinating character that you can sort of discover when you walk by as the communities grew, as well as passing right alongside the U.S. Steel Duluth works and some of the largest and most complex Superfund sites in the waterfront related to the remediation of pollution right in that area. And then also orienting or located along the trail are what we call river places, which are these landmarks and destinations along the river. Places like Spirit Island, which was one of the, which is a sacred place for the Ojibwe people, and one of the 7 stopping points in the Great Migration. Then also a wide range of other fascinating places that basically we attempted to sort of bring more awareness to in what I think in many cases is sort of a sort of sleepier, more wild, sort of post-industrial stretch of the St. Louis River, sort of a little bit a ways away from downtown Duluth. And so prior to our work developing this interpretive plan, there was a mini master plan that was created that identified a series of trail improvements, as well as proposed new park spots, waterfront access points, and programming such as like boat launches, improved places for people to put kayaks into the water, a wide range of things that were identified as part of this larger master plan for the area that organize a lot of the park infrastructure in a way that this trail will be able to serve the needs and better connect people in the neighborhoods and community to this stretch of the river. Because for the most part, the trail runs parallel with the LSMR excursion train that currently travels back and forth between Boy Scout Landing and the area right by Indian Point where their station is. And so it's a shared trail that preserves the rail that activities that are there, but also creates space for cyclists and pedestrians to explore the waterfront in a more comfortable way. So our task was to think about how do we tell stories on top of this framework where you have this rich history and a wide variety of experiences, including participation in the history of the trains and the industrial character of the area. So when we were developing the plan, we really broke it out into a few specific components that we felt would kind of holistically allow us to start to kind of tell a lot of the big stories that are present within the estuary. And so we called these story threads, which because of the nature of geography and the way people explore spaces are kind of distributed throughout the landscape. So you might find the sort of ruins and relics of industry all over the place in this stretch of the river, as well as Native American burial grounds and all kinds of fascinating habitats for different kinds of wildlife. And so we took that approach of trying to tell some of these big stories by really trying to create specific visitor experience goals, which were about enhancing people's comfort when exploring this part of the landscape, and also kind of creating a sort of series of sequential kind of opportunities for people to discover kind of new facets of the landscape they might not have been aware of. including the people who've lived there in the past and the different wildlife that they may be lucky enough to encounter. And we did this through the creation of interpretive elements, which I'll show some examples of. But these are installations along the trail that are designed to orient visitors to some of these amazing aspects of the place, and also to serve as wayfinding and sort of station points in people's exploration. And as part of that, we carefully thought about the location of where these would go as they related to some of those river places, which we wanted to call out and bring people's attention to, whether it's an old factory that has now become overgrown with woodlands, and you can still sort of explore the blast furnaces, or discovering an artesian spring that flows out of a hillside at the top of a wetland draw. So we looked at a lot of these places and wanted to help orient visitors and find them. And then also giving the city of Duluth a detailed sort of a thoughtful plan for how to implement this, and coming up with costs to allow them to pursue grant and other funding opportunities to build out these interpretive elements as part of the trail. So one of the things that we wanted to be a defining feature of this process was taking a very intentional approach to how we cultivated research and developed an artistic vision for the plan. So we worked with a local historian named Christine Carlson, who is from Fond du Lac and is in love with the area, and I would also say with the people. And that a lot of her historical work has involved really, interviews with people who spent their lives living and working along this stretch of the river, and cataloging those stories along with photographs and geographical identification of some of these places. For example, like the Chambers Quarry, which was located in now what is Chambers Grove Park in Fond du Lac, which was an operational quarry for about a decade. And also that the Chambers family did, basically like donated the land to the city ultimately to serve as a park space. The work, like I mentioned, that Sarah Agaton House did in terms of portraying some of the different animals and plant species, including, for example, this illustration of Manuman, that became what we considered to be kind of the orienting guides to people's experience of this stretch of the river. That the idea that you would encounter this iconography and then have the opportunity to see it portrayed artistically and then try to find it in real life in the landscape, and that the idea that these function as kind of like spirits that help, kind of orient people to what's out there. And then likewise, one of the other lead designers on this project was John Kepke, who's a member of Urban Ecosystems and a professor at the University of Minnesota, who is of Ojibwe descent, who did a lot of the illustrations of some of the wildlife that are featured on the fact sheets that I'll show you in a bit. So that approach to art, I think, really was about us trying to find ways that we could tell some of these big stories of the estuary without trying to get too like basically giving ourselves the flexibility to really explore and characterize a wide variety of stories that we would find during the process. And so some of the really big stories that we thought were important to tell through all these little sort of individual instances was really the power of the natural estuary as this landmark place where, it's this space where you, are right on the edge of Lake Superior. It's one of the most rich kind of like spawning grounds for fish and a rookery for birds. Places like Jay Cook State Park and the waterfalls that come through the river. I mean, it's this incredible place that also has changed so much through time in terms of once being entirely at the bottom of a glacial lake, or as the sort of banks of the bank, or the banks are kind of always collapsing and sort of pulling back away from the river. So we wanted to tell those stories, as well as a lot of the great migrations of people coming into this area, whether that was for example, the great migration of the Ojibwe and Anishinaabe people from the eastern United States to this area, as well as the settlement and colonization of this area by the United States, And then also one of the stories that I think was a really important story that Christine brought to the forefront is the migration of African-American workers to this area sort of in the sort of early part of the 20th century to work at the steel mills and in a lot of the burgeoning industries in Duluth. Because Duluth also has historically been this place that's very globally connected in terms of raw materials and processed minerals and other things basically being shipped out and then also becoming a port and railroad hub for things coming in. And that things like the fur trade, which was probably the first sort of major extractive industry in this area that had widespread that preceded timber and mining and other interests, but really shaped a lot of the sort of cultural interactions between the sort of European settlers and the Native American people in developing an integrated economy over hundreds of years. Really also talking about the legacy of treaties, reservations, and land seizures as those basically took place in this area and the contested nature of those things. We wanted to make sure we were really showing the nature of Duluth as this city of industry, really celebrating and acknowledging the sort of accomplishments of Duluth's industrial history, while at the same time understanding in the next story about restoration and reciprocity, this notion of acknowledging the damage that has done to a lot of the sensitive ecosystems of the river, and what now we kind of owe the river in terms of responsibility to make sure that we are rectifying and addressing, sort of some of like the negligence and issues that contributed to that, the sort of impacts to that ecosystem. And then one of the other big stories that came out through our engagement with a lot of the community members that we worked with and members of the Fond du Lac Band is, the story of the Seven Fires prophecy, which is really a kind of existential challenge that is posed to humanity, I think, to basically either change the way that we understand the world and how we relate to it and care about it, or else face extinction and annihilation as a result of our own sort of carelessness and foolishness. So I think that these are really a lot of these big stories that we felt we could kind of provide windows into as we created places along the trail. So our interpretive approach was based on a sort of hierarchical model, which is the idea that in order for people to appreciate this place, they need to be able to access it. There needs to be ways for people to get down to the waterfront, to regardless of age or ability, to explore the place at a level and be comfortable in the process of doing it, because we see that as a fundamental sort of prerequisite to all the other experiences that could follow. And that beyond that, thinking about what elements could be in this landscape that will help aid people's enjoyment and appreciation. A lot of these are things like spots like open beaches by the edge of the water, areas with turf grass, or just basically understanding where places where people might want to stop and have a nice overlook over a beautiful stretch of the river. That these are the kind of moments that are critical to people's not only accessing, but also really appreciating and being happy in the space. And the idea that if you can get someone to appreciate and enjoy where they're at, that they also will start to, through repeat visits and observation, cultivate greater awareness of a lot of the phenomenon and other creatures that are present within the landscape. And that ultimately that can lead to seeking experiences where people are actively exploring, paddling, getting out into these landscapes and really looking for, paying attention to a lot of these aspects of the landscape and learning from them. And the idea that ultimately the goal is to make it so that people develop a connection and sense of caring towards this landscape and an appreciation for how sort of diverse and multi-layered it is. And so we came up with a series of experience goals that were about making people feel welcome, being able to reveal things to people that they might not be able to see otherwise that can hopefully change their perspective. Also really embracing the wide range of sort of senses, tactile, feeling, thinking about how your body, whether you're feeling kind of exposed or whether you're concealed. And through this process, encourage people to both return and have a greater care and respect for this landscape. And so one of the challenges, or sort of, I think, problem statements that was kind of put to us is one of not wanting to do things that are extravagant or sort of overly sort of built or sort of externally sort of placed into this landscape. So one of the things that we did early on was really sort of explore the materials that you find in this landscape and try to make those the things that become the way you tell these stories. And so part of that was having typographies and logos and a sort of style for the artwork and text that was consistent with a color palette and range of sort of things that would be designed to really help people see that there's a consistency throughout this process. And then also looking for the materials that you might find, the sedentary brownstone that's in the hillsides, the granite or basalt chunks that are architectural rubble that was used as ballast to thrown in under the railroad tracks, the birch trees, the driftwood, the remnants of steel pellets, whether it's taconite pellets, core 10 steel equipment and infrastructure, or whether just slag is like a waste product, that these things are the authentic materials of this landscape. And so,
hey, Sam.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just had a question about the stories, and you don't have to go back to the slide though, but
sure.
Was it hard to decide on 8?
Well,
like, was it like a list of a million that you like got down, or how'd you do that?
This was a really tough part of the process, I think, because I think what we wanted to do was kind of use a more associative approach, where we kind of saw these big stories that were kind of told in history and the geology and in the sort of like natural resources and kind of wildlife that are present, and tried to kind of distill that down into ones that I think just kind of represented some of the broad themes that I think people can encounter in this landscape. But it was tough. I mean, it was a challenging process to kind of think about how you kind of capture a lot of that. It's always tough, I think, trying to distill things into sort of categories, or and so that's where we wanted them to be kind of open-ended, I guess.
Yeah, they feel like resonant to me, and I was just thinking about the process. So yeah, thanks for sharing. And back to story polls.
Sure. Yeah. So okay. So so the story polls were a way that we wanted to really kind of honor the ore and steel making legacy of the area, but also really put front forward the Ojibwe language and traditional respect for the plants and animals of the estuary by using Ojibwe language and the artwork that Sarah created, basically being laser cut and etched into the steel. So these are 10-foot tall steel panels or steel poles that basically are like an obelisk that we sort of see as a very kind of like authentic statement of like the people and the sort of industry of Duluth. And then, as you can see, there are these stainless steel animals that accompany. One second, here we go. That accompany the poles that basically brand the different segments of the trails with a name that is with a type of animal or wildlife that you would likely be able to encounter along the trail. So, for example, Misqua Daisy, the turtle, when one of the first ones that we're going to be putting in as a prototype is this story pole, and we chose a spot where when you are standing there, there's rocks all over the area, and that's a spot where turtles like to hang out. So trying to think about how these things are placed so that they are something that someone will encounter along a trail. So it's not necessarily near like an important place. It's more just a sort of thing that you come across in the woods. And that this is the way that the segments are kind of reorganized according to these different different animals that are sort of represented on each of these story poles. And that within each of these that we looked for ways to communicate, some sort of in John's illustrative, style, what the animals look like, in a more sort of realistic sense, as well as combining, some knowledge where, so for example, you can share for all these plant illustrations that Sarah had done, there's the Anishinaabe Moen word, and then there's the English translation and the scientific name, so that you kind of like have a way of like sort of learning a little bit more about some of these creatures. So you can see this is from the Migizi story pole, where it's got the bald eagle, the illustration, and then also that we thematically linked these things in terms of the white pine being the animal that's portrayed, or the plant that's being portrayed here, and also combining it with stories. And these stories aren't exclusively Native American stories. These are stories from a lot of different places, but we did sort of draw from a lot of the storytelling. And so, I mean, this specific story tells about like the eagle's role in Anishinaabe legends as the kind of intermediator between the creator and humans, and basically sort of the one who advocates for the creator not destroying the world despite the wickedness of people. And so then also on these story poles we have portrayals of the lifeways, or the different ways that people have made a living in the estuary, and that includes things like the Anishinaabe traditions of ricing, or the work that was done in terms of the lumber and timber mills, or the lumber mills along this stretch of the river during certain peak years of the lumber industry. And, for example, as a visitor, this is overlooking Radio Tower Bay. That prior to restoration, the whole area had been filled with wood waste that was all dumped there during the lumber mill and just never cleaned up. But now this area has been restored. So this is an example of a sign that someone would see, where from the position they're standing in, they can look out onto this landscape, recognize the footings of the old radio tower that are still in the bay, but also see the difference that it has made that someone excavated out all this wood waste that had basically plugged up this area of the bay. And so this is where we worked with the MPCA, the DNR, and the Fond du Lac Band to really try to find ways to tell stories that show the hard work and effort that people have put in over the last few decades to really make major improvements to the water quality of the river estuary. And then also really on these story poles, telling stories about the people who have lived right in these areas. And so this is a photograph on the left from Christine Carlson's collection of a bunch of boys who lived in New Duluth, who basically, were working and going to school, sort of like putting in 4 hours at the factory each morning, going to school, and then putting in 4 hours at the factory after school. And, as a result, they all bought bikes, and got a picture taken of them. Or the other person that's shown here is Oshigwan, and this is a woman who was present during the signing of the Treaty of 1847, who was one of the elders who was, according to the story, 100 years old at the time, but lived on an island, Naguk Island, off of Fond du Lac in the middle of the river. Or, for example, the history of the Riverside shipyards as a place that now it's currently a marina, but was a major shipbuilding location during World Wars I and II. And then also, celebrating the importance of Spirit Island and Spirit Lake, which, also overlaps exactly with the area where a lot of the effluent and pollution from the U.S. Steel plant also came into. So the idea that a visitor standing in this location would both be able to kind of appreciate the scale and sort of like amount of industry, but also recognize the sacredness and kind of eternal character of the same place. And like I was saying, you know, stories about, these are also things that Christine Carlson did, which was interviewing people who had worked at the US Steel Mill. And in this case, this man, David Nins, who was also a US Army veteran, and lived and worked in the area. But so, yeah, like I was saying, these story polls are the things that people would encounter, and that these stories would be told and present on there in the form of either story polls, or in some cases as freestanding signs that would be oriented towards specific views or projects that might have been done. We also propose creating cairns that have these local materials like the slag or the limestone that are used as like trail markers for places where there's spur trails that go off, where people can explore, you know, walking out to the end of Slag Point, or exploring an old quarry, those kind of things. And so the whole process that we worked through with the city was also about identifying critical partnerships in terms of who are the agencies that this plan, you know, would really be implementing a lot of information and ideas as a result, to reflect all the work and effort that's gone in. The idea to do some specific site design and identification of specific elements that can accompany these story polls. This, for example, might be, you know, timber that is, you know, sort of like milled benches, you know, in the one company where the lumber mill used to be. And we also provided guidelines for how to fabricate these things, which I can show everybody. We've got a couple of prototypes here of some of the freestanding signs, a slice of one of the story poles with the logo on it, and then an example of what some of the laser cut, you know, animal guides that would be, that visitors could encounter. And the idea is that these would be carefully placed in the landscape so that they're kind of just a thing that someone sees kind of glinting in the background. And that also that we would create spaces where it's open-ended, where, you know, places where there's opportunities for public art or other activities. So yeah, so anyway, thanks for listening. I'm not sure how I've been doing on time, but it's fun talking about it. So anyway, yeah, I guess I'm curious if anyone has any questions or thoughts about what we've done.
Searching for the mute button, or unmute button, I should say. But I have a question. I'm curious, when do you have a timeline for starting to kind of put these things out on the trail? When is that stage happening?
Sure. So, so one of the things, we finished this plan in time for a lot of the opinion of cost that we included to be incorporated into an LCCMR grant that is intended to pay for a lot of these interpretive elements. And so basically, that grant, which I don't know that it's been approved yet, I think it was recommended for approval. But I don't know that the money has been awarded yet. I'm going to go to the map in a minute here. But I believe that the initial funding that was awarded is going to be enough to complete segments 0, which is the existing trail, but we're going to be putting new interpretive elements in there, as well as segments 1 and 2. So that work would, I think, all be done as part of the first phase of the trail. And then I believe that there is still some additional negotiation and work that is being done to figure out how the trail will be oriented through the areas, especially through the areas that are part of the US Steel property, because there's a lot of sort of interlocking kind of decision making going on there that I think is still evolving. But then I believe what's probably going to happen is that segments 7, 6, and 5 are going to be, I think these are planned to be built in a few years, whether it's like 2024, I'm not sure exactly, but I think a lot of it's still kind of, you know, being figured out.
Thanks. And a great presentation. Really great to hear how much thought has gone into the, you know, plan, and very, very cool to see.
Well, Samuel, I noted this in the chat, but this is, based on what you're telling us, this has been an incredibly thoughtful process. And I really can't wait to see it come to full fruition. You're trying to inform me that her Zoom froze and she's got to bail and come back. So that's why you get me instead.
Yeah.
But I mean, were there any roadblocks in the planning and design process, or was it just buttery smooth, or like,
well,
what kind of challenges did you come across?
Yeah, well, so this project basically initiated in like March 2020. So this started like right when COVID happened.
Oh, geez.
And so that threw a wrench into the public engagement process that we had initially planned, which was more about, kind of like online presentations, but in-person community presentations and discussions.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that we did in this plan, we used a tool called Social Pinpoint, which is like an online map-based tool where what people are able to do is we created a survey, and it's like a sort of Google Maps style interface where people can explore an area. And basically we created a series of different tabs that were things like stories, like basically river places, the kinds of things we were talking about, those kind of general categories or kind of ways that we wanted to frame the experience. We kind of gave those to a lot of the people that were part of our expanded stakeholder group. So in addition to a few larger presentations where we really sort of put it out to the public, part of what we spent a lot of time on the front end doing was really kind of reaching out very specifically to people from a variety of different groups, whether it was, the Isaac Walton League or, the DNR, or people that were part of like the local sort of like recreation and guide community. So part of this was integrating with groups that wanted to think about paddling or mountain bikes and cycling, or a lot of the folks who are historical train enthusiasts. We had conversations with a lot of these folks, mostly in kind of like a, I would say in a kind of one-on-one, or sort of in sometimes like we'd assemble a group of people together to talk about some specific things. But, trying to sort of just hear a lot of what people had. And then part of what we did was use this Social Pinpoint tool to allow people to kind of place their own kind of stories and then also comment on other people's. So for example, to sort of seed things and get started, I took a lot of the initial research that we did in site photography, because you could post a photo of a spot and say, Slag Point, right here, that's a jetty that was built out of waste slag, back in the 20s. So that barges could land and unload stuff right next to the US Steel plant, but, and now there's just that remnant in this wetland that filled in at the end of the creek that runs through there. So it's like, those kind of things that I think we found that this tool was nice to be able to get, empower people to sort of say, hey, this is a place that matters to me, or, talk to this person about that, because I think that was the piece that kind of emerged, I think, really over time through kind of like almost just like a series of people talking to people, to find stories. Like one of my favorite stories that we uncovered was Babette Sandman, who's a member of the Indigenous Commission for the city of Minneapolis, when we presented this to them, she said, oh, I was on the crew that built the first segment of this trail, back in the 80s, because there was a time period in the 80s where they had a sort of program where anyone could show up and be like, I want a job. And they would give you a job doing trail construction or, some kind of public improvement thing. And so she spent a summer doing that. And, that was just one of those cool kind of things that we found just kind of by getting out there and just having conversations with a lot of people. So like you said, a lot of thought went into it. It was definitely kind of above and beyond scope in a lot of ways.
That's really awesome. And to be able to dig up stories like that, I mean, that stuff is priceless, really. So yeah, I mean, good on you for following through on all of that. I mean, hey, Luciana, are you living in Zoom now?
I'm back. I probably missed some good questions and answers, but I'm here.
Was there anything that you came across, Sam, that was particularly surprising in researching this project? Like, I mean, I'll be honest and sort of like hang my head in shame that I did not know that Slag Point was a thing on the estuary, and just call out that, we can always learn more, myself included. But I'm just, so that was surprising to me. So I'm wondering if there were any big surprises to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Christine really said it, or the historian Christine really said it best when she was saying, like, it's time for people to sort of appreciate this, sort of the western end of Duluth for how amazing it is. And that the one of the real things that I think became a priority for us as we were working on this project was to tell the stories that aren't the ones that have already been told already, and that a lot of those stories are ones that are kind of mundane stories about, real people living and working in this area, and that those were the stories, it was women's stories. It was stories that were Indigenous voices, things that oftentimes got kind of erased. I mean, you think about something like Jay Cook State Park, like Jay Cook, paid for a railroad and came here one time, but, there were many people who spent their entire lives, kind of in this area, who contributed a lot more sort of meaningfully in terms of their, personal contributions and like life experiences. And so I think that was something that Christine, we were so lucky and to be able to, incorporate her, archives and her knowledge about the place and the people into the whole project. And since then, the city of Duluth has been very active, I think, in really appreciating a lot of the work that she has done in trying to document those, stories and things to make sure that it all, that people see it, because I think that's what a lot of this area, like we said, it's like if you're not oriented to some of these things, they're invisible. And but when you can kind of open up a view into some aspect of the history of the place, or someone who lived there, it I think it creates a powerful kind of connection to the place in a way that you don't get just from a like I'm trying to think of a good example, but you wouldn't get that from a kind of more like big kind of installations and stuff like that. I mean, the goal isn't to make this putting a lot of big things that are going to kind of tell, like big sculptures and all that kind of stuff. The goal is just to kind of like show people what's already here,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to me, it feels more, like you said, more intimate and more, or excuse me, less like a textbook overlay of the landscape or of this place. And I think that's pretty great. Also, I really feel like Luciana and I need to connect with this Christine person.
Yeah, I can totally share her email with you. She's fantastic to talk to.
I would love that.
I'm wondering, Sam, if a tiny bit of silence is okay and not too awkward, just to give time for folks who are watching, in case they need some time to think of questions to unmute and ask or put in the chat. So yeah, we're going to be quiet for a tiny bit. Okay, you don't have to have questions. Sam, did you have more to share, or should I ask a question that I have? Should we keep, what's the vibe?
Sure.
Oh,
I mean,
sorry. You answer me, and then Jerry did have a question, so silence worked.
so you're asking Jerry if there will be security at the parking areas. I think I mean, for example, as part of the process, there were specific access points that we were calling pause points that in most cases are aligned with where there are, boat launches, public waterfront access points. And there are a number of improvements to those planned. And I believe, in terms of the city of Duluth's, program, like part of what we wanted to do was, like not have like basically not have things that were going to be breakable. We wanted to make sure that the spaces that are created, the installations that are there, that they're kind of not precious and that they're of the place. But in terms of the specific security, I think it varies from place to place. Like some places are lit or are, have like restricted hours. But I don't know specifically for all of them what is being proposed. I think a lot of that's going to be determined during the like actual sort of final build out pieces for the like rest of the site work.
Sam, at this stage in the project, is there anything that like people who live in Duluth and Superior or visit there often like can or should do to like help or be involved?
Yeah, well, one of the things that, so there's a number of groups. So like, for example, there's a group called the Indigenous Women's Water Sisterhood, I believe. And they do what are called water walks, where they, basically, and I couldn't do it justice in terms of describing specifically the purpose, but one of the things that they wanted to do was create a like a natural play area, but by and gathering space by Munger Landings in Smithville. And so they had a grant and they basically came to the city of Duluth and said, we'd like to do this. And so that was a piece that we integrated into the planning process. And similarly, I think there's been a number of neighborhood groups that have talked about wanting to have signage that speaks to the fact, like, for example, as you walk along the trail, there's great spots where it's like you could have a sign that basically says, welcome to Morgan Park, or, something that orients people to the historic, layout of Riverside, that those are things where a lot of local folks were involved in sort of coming up with ideas or suggestions related to that. And that there's spaces along here that have been identified as potential places where you could have, kind of like sculptures or other public art that could be implemented. And most of that we didn't kind of try to design that other than just sort of trying to carve out space for it to happen when community members, had the initiative to do something.
So yeah, it seems like, yeah, there's space for it to be its thing and like be added to or change. That's, yeah, a really nice way to plan it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I think that was one of the things, like, in addition to the sort of how do you have the 8 big stories or whatever, then how, I think that was a real challenge for us too, is how do you choose this each, if you have a story pole and each one can have an animal, a map, and a couple of stories to it, or, it's like, we tried to make it so that they kind of supported each other. So for example, down in this stretch of the river, down on the, one second, just kind of draw real quick. Over here, kind of on the west end of the river, this is one of the major areas where a lot of wild rice restoration is taking place along the waterfront. And so that's where, for the story pole in this area, we wanted the plant to be about Manuman, the animal to be the loon, and some of the Lifeways talking about, ricing. So, trying to think about from a single vantage point where you've got a view of a specific landscape, what are a few sort of interconnected stories that kind of take place in that spot? And that a lot of that, I think comes from, the history of the people, and, kind of like choosing things that people can actually sort of see from that location.
My logistics brain is going here, and we've got 5 minutes left. I have one more question before I launch into a closing, but want to give space in case somebody else has a question. They've been waiting until the last minute. I'm gonna go. Sam, you talked about like accessibility and comfort of like how you want it to feel for people, and I'm wondering if you can give us like an example of one thing in your mind that like is comfort to you. Like, what is one example that you feel like is made?
You mean that makes a place feel more comfortable?
Yeah, or how you feel like you did it in at least one part of this project.
Yeah, I would say in many cases, part of it was when we talked about what we called pause points in this. There was this idea of creating kind of circular gathering spaces in the landscape, and the unifying element between these is just that it's a circle. There's nothing else more than that. But the idea is that by just drawing that circle in a place in the landscape, you're kind of delineating it from what's around and saying, this is a place. And part of our process with that was also about not, keeping it simple, but placing these in spots that they kind of orient you to, that you're in a spot that's really sort of pleasant to be in. I'm trying to think of a great example, but one of them would be, for example, like Slag Point. There's currently a very rough walk out across Slag Point that I think as part of the park plan, the idea is that you would, and also Slag Point periodically is inundated with water, and there's like driftwood all over it. So, I mean, it's like some of these places are kind of hard to access, but I think we wanted to make it so that there were places that were sort of called out and, where there's like would be intentional sort of accommodations made to like, bring people to really nice places where you're sitting right by the waterfront, or where you've got a great prospect over the surrounding landscape. And I think that like it's those kind of things where the comfort is oftentimes physical. Like it's not even like it's just a raw human kind of like, oh, I've got sunshine on my face, wind in my hair, like fresh water, like those are things that I think people are really drawn to. And as long as you create places that are sort of physically accessible to people, that's really what we saw as kind of the starting point there.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I just feel like I'm inside right now, but if I just think about the by the water, sun on me, I already feel better. I think I'm probably going to close here unless there's anything else you'd like to impart, Sam, before we go.
No, but thank you for inviting me. It was fun being able to talk about this. Like I said, this project was a lot of work, and we really kind of at a certain point sort of stopped looking at it as a as like a sort of like dollars and cents exercise, and more of a thing where we wanted to capture these stories and put them in a format that people could kind of like draw on them and use them as like inspiration for transforming this whole stretch of the river, and just appreciating it.
Yeah, wow. And thanks for giving it life too. I scrolled through the PDF of the interpretive plan, and hearing you just describe it brings it to life, and I can't wait until we can touch it. So like you said, thank you. I want to thank you for sharing with the group tonight, and to everybody who came. River Talks is a series, so there's more. We skipped the month of December, but the next River Talk is going to be January 12th in 2022. And it's about Spirit Island and Spirit Lake in the St. Louis River. So it really relates to what Sam was showing us on the map. And that one will be with Jeff Savage of the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Ojibwe. And we will decide if it is virtual or in person closer to the event time. So you can check the Lake Superior Reserve website of events for updates, or you can follow on the Sea Grant blog post that lists out all of the river talks for fall 2021 and winter 2022. So thank you for coming. You can turn on your video and wave goodbye if you want, or just log off.
Thanks a lot, Sam. This was really great.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.